Cunnasty, how are ye? Welcome to the Candlelittales podcast. This episode is an interview. Aron grabbed Daniel Allison from the House of Legends podcast. Daniel came over to Ireland and he very kindly jumped up on stage with us at MVP to do a live story at our show there. And then he sat down with Aron and they had a lovely chat. This podcast is supported by our patrons at patreon.com/candlelittales. And if you would like to join them, you can go there, or you can make a one-time donation using the PayPal button on our website. Like and share, and above all, enjoy. And for now, enjoy Aron talking to Daniel.
Thanks very much for coming on the Candlelittales podcast, and it's a pleasure to have you here.
It's such a pleasure to be here.
I'm delighted, I really am. It's been such a treat because I guess kind of hilariously you landed into Ireland out of nowhere and you ended up crashing in my gaff, coming to see a show, jumping up telling a story, and now you're on our podcast. I didn't know you 2 days ago.
Yeah, that sums it up perfectly.
It's a good story. It's not a bad story.
Yeah, and I knew you because, as we both know, there's this weird podcast thing where you listen to someone's podcast a lot, you feel like you know them when they don't know you at all. We both experienced that probably from both sides, you know,
Absolutely.
of the relationship. So I knew you, now you know me.
Absolutely, and it's gorgeous because, as we were just saying, the podcast thing, which I'm not great at doing, I try and do a bit, is reach out to people, interview them, have a conversation, and talk about the shared passion and the joy of storytelling, myth, the meaning between folklore, history, legends, and all the magic that's in between. And you end up having a lovely conversation with somebody for a concentrated, in-depth analysis of that shared passion, which you don't quite get unless you're sitting at a bar in the middle of nowhere and having a good chat with somebody that you just met. But at the same time, your podcast, House of Legends, you tell a story and you interview someone every month. So it's a lovely little kind of crossover. You're constantly going out there and having these chats with people. So I admire you for your tenacity to seek down other stories that are so fair play.
Thank you. Yeah, it has been an incredible journey, and I've been so fortunate in that I have been able to speak to dozens and dozens of these incredibly interesting storytellers and writers and mythologists and so on, and have these great conversations. When you're saying every month, I feel guilty because I've been a bit bad this past year because like yourself, it's grown a lot and it's gone from being a podcast to being teaching and for me a membership site and doing all these other things. So I've been a little bit slack lately.
Well, don't beat yourself up because let's just rewind, because I want to get to the fact that you have a storytelling membership thing on your website, which is amazing, a storytelling course. We were teaching as well a little bit, so we have that kind of passion and drive to do that and spread the glorious story as well. But let's rewind. Let's go back.
Let's do that.
Whoa. Okay, so Daniel Allison, what brought you to story?
I grew up with story as my refuge, my medicine. It was what made me happy. Like, I lived in the countryside and
Scotland. Where exactly?
In East Lothian, up in the Lammermuir Hills. So hills covered in sheep and not a lot else. And weren't many other kids around, and if there were, they probably wouldn't have liked me because it was a bit strange. And stories, books, myths, legends, fantasy, animal stories were what made me happy. That was just where I went, and everything was right and everything made sense. And then, of course, the whole life happened, and still loved stories, still loved books. And I suppose there came a point where I looked at myths and legends in a different way, when I was prompted by people like Martin Shaw and Michael Meade and Clarissa Pinkola Estes, just to realise that these weren't just really cool, interesting, weird stories, but that they had all these incredible dimensions to them, which were about all of our lives and which connected not just my modern life, but didn't just speak to that life, but spoke to the lives of people all over the world in all kinds of societies, and that just blew my mind and started this new relationship.
Yeah. I mean, like, it's such a beautiful introduction to Michael Meade. In my brother passed on a story of the black dog, and this old woman knitting and keeping on knitting this beautiful fabric, and since then I've just I'm such a fan of the fact that he's still giving out these stories that are so meaningful. And recently listened to How to Become an Elder from Chris Pinkola Estes. Or Estes?
Dr. Estes is the cheap way of saying her
Doctor,
name.
yeah, you just get it in. Yeah. And it's kind of, I feel like a bit of a sham then when I can like, yeah, I'm in storytelling, but like these guys are like using monumental kind of mythic archetypes to explore human nature and what it is to be human, how to grow with dignity and be wise throughout it and look back and really learn from it. I feel like, yeah, I've only scratched the surface on how deep and meaningful stories can be, because I guess I've always used them as, chances to escape, kind of like you mentioned as a kid, and that joy of story. So back to you, not me. You grew up in the countryside, you love stories, and as I think everybody does, it's a natural thing. We learn through stories. We learn third person perspective through a story. And so what was it that brought you into performing with stories and using it as a vehicle to actually get your voice out?
Yeah, I think I had this strange thing going on as a child and as a young person where I was like incredibly shy, but wherever I did any kind of drama at school or any kind of performance thing, this animal leapt out.
Oh, wow.
And it was like that was where I could be myself. I was far more myself there than I was in kind of ordinary situations. And I kind of still feel that way about stories, and that when I enter a story, whether telling it or reading it, I feel like I'm more me than, I don't know, walking around and going to Tesco. But
never good to be under those halogen lights. You're like, oh no.
Yeah, well, it's useful at times. But I think that I thought I was going to be an actor for a number of years, but that the world just didn't quite feel like my world. But it was literally just discovering that the storytelling world existed. I read some of Martin Shaw's and Michael Mead's work, and that blew my mind, as I said. And at the same time, I was getting didgeridoo lessons in Edinburgh, and my didgeridoo teacher just showed me a picture of his storytelling mentor, David Campbell, then became my mentor, and told me about this guy and told me that this tradition existed of, we're so focused on texts and books, and I'd always thought of myths and legends and traditional stories as things that lived in books, and I learned that there were these people who told them, and that the telling of them, the sharing of them, listening to them, and the community that exists around that act and that experience is as important as the stories themselves. And that blew my mind, and I just knew instantly that was what I was supposed to do. Brilliant. That was the thing I didn't know about my life, and I just instantly started doing it.
Fantastic. I mean, it's such a funny thing to actually find performance as the thing that jumps you out of self into an energetic kind of way of being human and engaging in emotions, high, low. I used to think it's like going on a roller coaster, so you could just go through all the emotions and feel the sadness, feel the joy, feel the real excitation of the things that's in the story that's much, much bigger than walking around a supermarket, which feels really numb and dumb, and everything is pushed down. I love the fact that you found story through an introduction. Oh yeah, this is actually a thing. While doing didgeridoo lessons, I mean, good for breath control. Do you still play?
I've because I've been living in Thailand quite a lot, and as a didgeridoo with me, I've kind of fallen off a bit, but I can still play, and I do love to play. But like, it's such a good point you make there. Like this roller coaster of experiencing all the emotions, and not just all the emotions, but all the different facets of existence that it's beyond human existence, different modes of existence that we can experience through telling a story, because you're playing and you're narrating and you're talking about all the characters. So you're the giant, and then you're the prince, and then you're the crow, and then you're all of these beings, and each of them you get to just leap into and embody, and that's you going beyond your ordinary everyday Tesco shopping human self. And it does just make you bigger, because then you're like, okay, what's Crow Aron like? What's Crow Daniel like? And there's nothing wrong with being completely crazy, weird crow person, because that's what you've been booked to do. You're supposed to be. You're supposed to be a bit nutty and entertaining. Yeah. And why would you not want to do that?
I love the fact that you how you talk about embodying them, because again, I guess with the myths, when they're on pages, when they're books, they're very matter of fact and it's sequential, like, what happens, and there's a cause and effect in the story, but it's very surface level. You get to know what Fionn did, what Fionn said, and what everyone else did as a reaction, and the cause and effect, and you get to read these things, but you don't get a chance to get inside it, inside the emotion, inside the head. on most, until you get the rewritings, of course, and modern kind of reiterations. But in the transcriptions, the older texts, you get very matter of fact, and you get whole lineages of where they came from, whole descriptions of what they're wearing. But it's all on the surface, you know. So yeah, I mean, like, it's interesting to hear you say you get a chance to jump into it, because, you know, if you're coming from an acting point of view, you've, like, from originally, I guess, from that performance style, you've obviously, you know, gone into the characterization of stuff and had an ability or a desire and a want to get out of your own head and into something else.
Yeah.
And, you know, when you tell a story, you're not just telling the surface level facts, you're trying to tap into the emotionality and what's underneath it, and inside someone's, you know, heart, as they're making the decision to, you know, go off with Fand or stay with Emer, or, you know, kill your own son Canla on Bally's Strand, and what that must actually feel like, or whatever the story is. You have to figure out what's going on for the person, rather than the facts and the matter of the case.
Yeah, and the thing is, you're not just doing that and everyone watching you having this lovely time exploring these things yourself. They're going through it with you too, which is your purpose in a big way, because when the audience are watching you and you're becoming Crow and you're becoming Cuchulainn to some degree, depending on how well you're doing your job and how open they are to this, they're experiencing it too. And so it's this group cathartic experience in which we all go beyond our everyday selves. And that's so incredibly meaningful, because I think so many times in our lives, we just need to remember that we're not just this one part of ourselves, that we have all these different faces, we have all these different aspects. We have our giant, and it's good to be giant sometimes.
Yeah.
We have our, you know, witchy, mossy character who goes out into the woods and does those kinds of things, and you experience that in the story, and you, oh God, yeah, I've got that part of myself, and some fire is lit inside of you, and you go away thinking, ooh, I might get more in touch with that part of myself.
Yeah. I like it. I mean, again, the whole idea of the collective consciousness, the old collective, is so ripe and visible when telling a story to a whole room of people where, like, the eyes are closing, you know, especially when the beat of the story is kind of rhythmically tapping along, and something is moving, and there's a current of emotion that's kind of flowing through a room, and you can't help but get carried away in it, whether I'm listening to it or experience it as a teller, or like I often get it when I'm just listening to Soraka tell stories next to me, and just like, wow, just like I can feel myself getting swept away in it, as I did with your story tonight, which we'll get to. But I still have a couple more questions, because I guess that's live storytelling, and that's the experiential aspect. I think, you know, different strokes for different folks. Some people get that from going to theatre. Some people get it from music and folk songs, or some people get it from techno, and it's a spiritual thing to go to a psytrance concert for some people. And other people get it through movies, books, you know, live performance, live storytelling may not be everybody's thing, but it is also the oldest thing. Like, it came before all of that. Like, you know, it's the oral storytelling tradition is literally the oldest way of getting out of self and into the bigger. So it's kind of, it has this reverberation, I think, throughout the ages, where you're like, fuck, how many times has this story been told? Like, countless. In some iterations, depending on the story, like, how old, how many ways has this been woven together throughout as old as the hills, some of them. And there's something really humbling in that as well, is to, like, kind of participate in something like as ritualistic as old and as archaic and ancient and kind of tribal as the oldest ways of doing. I guess, you know, you could probably say dance as well, you know, or music, but you can argue other things. So I guess you started your podcast when you decided you wanted to start doing your storytelling and you know, go out and tell stories. What was it that led you through storytelling into podcasting, into now teaching and writing, and because I want to mention your books as well, and now continuing on this whole path of like the never-ending fascination with story and storytelling.
Yeah.
Can you join those dots for me in a narrative?
Yeah, I can. It's one of those ones that it's always hard to condense because there's so many different aspects to it. But I'd been thinking about starting a podcast, but all the podcasts I heard in which people were telling stories were ones in which they're approaching it in a very kind of light-hearted, taking the piss basically kind of way. And I thought, okay, that's what people want. Oh, they don't like they're not interested in what I'm doing. Until I heard Dan Carlin from the Amazing Hardcore History podcast talking about narrowcasting, about it's like podcasting is like the opposite of broadcasting. No matter how narrow your field of interest, there's other people who want to hear what you're doing or the particular way you're doing what you do. And I just thought, oh, so yeah, there will be people out there who like the kind of storytelling that I do.
Absolutely, yeah.
And around that time,
there's fucking loads of people. That's
there's loads of
fucking
people.
billions.
Yeah.
Like you'll find your niche, like
However weird you are, your crowd is
tribe.
out there. Yeah, and if you're so weird, it's only you. Well done. That's amazing.
Yeah, you deserve an award.
Yeah, you just get looked after for that. But anyway, I had a bit of a life crisis. Lots of things went wrong, and I realized I just needed a massive change. And I bought a one-way ticket to Thailand. I'd got interested in Muay Thai, Thai boxing. I'd really fallen in love with it, and I decided to just go and move into a Muay Thai gym, train, and do that. So I'd arranged all that, and then just before I left, I got my first publishing contract for a book of Fionn McColl's stories. So I was like, okay, I'll write that while I'm out there. Fantastic. I moved out there, moved into a gym in Koh Phangan in Thailand, started training there every day. I got a job doing their Instagram for them, so I got my meals and my training and some private training taken care of. So I was pretty sorted. So I wrote and I did Muay Thai and this kind of intense physical practice, this very sort of painful and really, really hard thing, kind of just gave me this fuel for, I don't know, I feel like I sweated out many phases of my life and everything that had gone before and made me very kind of ready for something new. And at the same time, I got business coaching from Sean Fagan, a Muay Thai fighter who'd really inspired me, and he helped me to kind of envision this new life and then this kind of warrior lifestyle of just training and fighting while writing these, warrior stories, Fianna stories.
Brilliant.
Gave me this sense of like, I can do anything kind of thing. Fantastic. So I thought, right, well, I'll start that podcast and then I'll start publishing some of my own stuff as well as the stuff that's being published. And then that led to when I went home and I got stuck in Scotland because of COVID after a visit, that led to teaching online, led to year courses, which led to a membership site, and all this stuff grew from there.
Wow. I mean, I like how you started with a very flippant kind of inciting incident of, sure, once I had my first contract to write a book, I suppose I'll just do it over. And like, that's the hard part, getting someone to actually ask you to write a book for a publishing club. So like, was there a couple of steps that you missed or skipped there, or?
I suppose, yeah. But that was a kind of weird thing in that I'd spent 10 years like getting up early and sitting there in the dark, writing fantasy before work, going and doing support work, and eventually having finished something, not getting anywhere with it, writing a second one, not getting anywhere with it. But then Donald Smith, who's the director of the Scottish International Storytelling Festival and a really wonderful man and mentor, I told him about this idea for a book of Fianna stories, and he said, you should get in touch with this person at the History Press about that. So I did, and then they were just like, yeah, sounds good. We're pretty much like, here's your contract.
Wow, that's things lining up for you. That's fantastic. Yeah. And it is actually, I mean, the reason I bring it back is because there's obviously a bit of a dark night of the soul there, and in that struggle through that, and that's oftentimes what we want to hear about. We don't want to just hear about, I got a contract, wrote a book, We also want to hear about the 10 fucking years of persevering, of struggling, because that's what we're mostly all doing is struggling through stuff to make, it's nice to get the reward or the feeling of a reward at the end of it, but there is so much creating your own luck in a way, because and getting your first break is always on the back of perseverance, trial, error, failures after failures after failures. You have to fail in order to try and succeed. And like, I don't know, I think there's it's interesting when that's left out of a story. I think like it's just like, obviously you know, it's because for me it's the most interesting. It's like, yeah, you did the hard work in order to get yourself into that position, which is extremely admirable, tenacious, and not very easy. So yeah, very impressed. But in terms of all your research for Fionn and the Fianna, and I'm delighted you got up to tell a Fianna story tonight. You, what, like, you know, in Scotland, you don't quite have as much of a rich connection to stories. Can you tell me what it's like over there? Because we grew up with stories here in Ireland. We get the basics in every primary school. Every Irish person will know Cuchulainn, Fionn McCool, probably Children of Lear. Even if that's just it, they'll probably know Oisin as well and Tiernan Og. That's like in nearly every primary school across the country. So that we have primed names. We kind of know them. They've been misused, you know, 100 years ago for the Civil War, potentially, you know, for various means to ends, and you know, the warrior archetype used to get people to join a war, and all of the ways now that have maybe muddied the mythos in Ireland for certain people, and with just reason. So there's like, you know, but there's still a lot of feeling, a lot of connection to it, a lot of ambiguity, and, you know, a lot of shadow there as well, but it's still there. And, you know, the cairns and the hills are still there, the standing stones are still there, the you know, the Giant's Causeway is still, everyone kind of knows there's a link there to a story, and there's explanations. Dermot and Grán, you have beds all over this country. You can't go too far without hearing a version of a Puka story, or a Banshee story that's local to an area, or something that's kind of connected that you'll find out if you go digging. And yeah, what's it like in Scotland? Do you have that kind of a culture of place and story, explanation and mythos, or is it kind of more way lost, I guess?
Yeah, it's really noticeable for me, having been traveling around Ireland for the last few weeks, and I've been on a few trips previous to this. You guys have a stronger connection to your cultural history and traditions than we do.
Interesting.
As far as I can see. Maybe I'm completely wrong, but that's what I'm perceiving and experiencing. Other Scottish people who are interested in this stuff, who've had similar journeys, have said the same thing.
Okay.
And there's probably all kinds of political and cultural and historical reasons for that, which I don't understand.
But let's figure it out though. Let's figure it out.
Yeah,
Let's blame the Brits.
Yeah, this is
let's just say it. Let's get it out there.
Yeah, you guys have held on, and there's that knowledge in, like you mentioned, the schools of at least knowing being taught the basic stories. We don't have that in Scotland. So right. At least when I grew up, if you're talking traditional stories, you're talking Jack and the Beanstalk, Little Red Riding Hood, the Grimm's ones, the ones which are, you know, taught in many different places. The Germanic tradition, yeah. I mean, I didn't know Scottish stories existed. It didn't occur to me to think about it. And I'm pretty sure it's a bit different now. I know, at least because, you know, I'm going to schools, and many people I know are going to schools and, you know, doing our best to change this. But it certainly wasn't there when I was growing up. And I think it's probably a bit different in the Highlands. You know, I think in the Highlands, out the way it is, just in any place, it seems out of the fringes, at the edges.
More mythic.
More mythic, yeah. People hang on to this kind of knowledge. You've got the Gaelic language, which is it was pretty strong in some parts of Scotland, so I'm sure a lot comes with that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, but I've for me, like, you know, I definitely never heard the words Fionn McCool until I got interested in oral storytelling in my late 20s. Definitely never heard those words.
Wow. I mean, like, and then you just went deep dive straight into research mode. Like talk me through that. Did you just buy books? Did you decide, like, fuck this, I wanna? Because I know there's a connection. Like Fionn goes, like, there's so many stories of of either, Cuchulainn going to the Isle of Skye and Skahawk and the training there. There's stories of the Fianna going to Scotland. There's the High-Heeled Alban, the name. There's also, a story I recently researched and put together. The Irish people were known as the Scotty for such a long time. And then the Scotty went to Scotland, possibly named after an Egyptian pharaoh. Maybe not, but she's also buried in Tralee, so who knows. So goes one story anyway. But again, that link to similar age-old people who travelled, the Scotty becoming the Scottish. The fact that the Northern Irish accent sounds kind of similar, very distinctly different to the Scottish accent. The meld, the blade, the Irish in Scotland, the crossover, the myths and the stories that brought the Fianna to Scotland and have these chapters overriding. And so I find it fascinating that Fionn McCool is both a hero and an Irish legend, but also has such a strong presence in Scotland for being in Ireland. You know what I mean? It's kind of like this shared hero that we both kind of have. No, maybe not as shared as I like to think, but certainly I've come across a couple of Scottish people who definitely know and tell the Fionn stories. So there's kind of like an interesting link there.
Yeah, the storytellers, like the older storytellers, who I learned from people like David Campbell and Donald Smith, who I mentioned, they know Fionn inside out. I mean, they really know this tradition, and they were encouraging me to look into this tradition from when I started. I mean, me personally, like, I was interested and I thought these stories were cool, but I was really confused by them and I didn't quite get the characters and I didn't know how to pronounce these names I was reading.
Very hard.
All this kind of stuff.
I don't know. I just guess. Yeah. People always think I know, but I'm like, that's just because I say it with conviction.
Okay, because I'm sort of listening to your podcast and going, well, that's how he says it, so it must be right.
Yeah. Again, that's a dialect. I'm from Cork, so I'll say Kieran, where up the rest of the country people say Kieran. So there's just a million different ways of pronouncing these things, and there's no real right way. There's a lot of wrong ways though.
Yeah, I know. And even I grew up, but once I got into stories, I heard Finn a lot more than Fionn, because a lot of people in Scotland will say Finn.
Same in Ireland.
Some people will seem to want to like rip my throat out for saying that. They're like, it's Fionn.
Yeah. Again, like when you go back to the Salmon of Knowledge, Finn and Finnegas, it does actually make more sense if his name is Finn, because that's the prophecy getting confused between Finnegas, and who gets the Salmon of Knowledge. But I always kind of like trip over that if I'm telling him like Fionn and then Finnegas, and they were similar but not the same. But again, Fionn means fair haired, so I guess depending where you're from, if you're up in a different part of the island, you could just pronounce it Finn, and that also means fair. So yeah, you started researching, and like I'm struggling to remember the name of a Scottish storyteller who has a night on, I think it's Wednesday nights. I think he's still going up in the Crane Bar in Galway. If you know who that is, I'm talking to the internet. If you know who that is, let me know. I can't remember, but I know he does a cycle of Fianna stories as well. So that's one of the guys I was kind of came across, whose name I can't remember, but the link is there. So you started with Fionn, and you kind of gone global with stories. Like you kind of went pretty far wide with your interest and research, and like you're drawn to like the four corners from what I can see. Anyway. Yeah. Tell me about your kind of like, I guess, the next leaping off point.
Yeah, well, I think I started off being a bit of a butterfly and thinking, well, I've travelled to various places around the world. I spent a lot of time in East Africa. I spent some time in the Amazon, Mexico, and I thought, it'd be interesting to know the stories from these far off, exotic, wonderful places. So I got really interested in all these kinds of things. I developed a real thing for Siberian stories, which I still very much have. And it was a kind of later thing of actually coming home and actually really starting to see the value in the Scottish stories, which the Scottish storytellers were kind of putting in front of me. And I was just a bit like, I want far off, exotic, shiny things. Yeah. And I started to love these things. And then what happened for me really was, I started to love these stories. I started to really appreciate and then completely fall in love with the Fianna stories. And then I started writing fiction, writing fantasy, which was pulling together my two loves of epic fantasy and traditional stories.
Cool.
And that's been the biggest thing for me, and that's the core thing for me, because in Ireland you had the monks writing down these legendary cycles, these mythic cycles of the Tuatha Dé Danann and the Firbolgs and so on, even if they're writing it down thinking this is a load of bollocks, but we might as well write it down for posterity.
Yeah.
Cheers, guys.
Good man, lads.
Yeah.
Good man, lads.
Same in Wales with the Mabinogion, but we do not have that in Scotland. You've got mostly it's folk tales, and we've got a certain number of Fianna stories, but we don't have those epic mythic legendary cycles. No reason to think that these kind of things didn't exist, but they were not written down. So for me, there has been this big process of being really sad about that, and then thinking, well, hold on, there's quite a lot of opportunity there to imagine and dream into the gaps.
But even the cycles themselves are reimagining. They're reordering.
Sure.
They're just like, they weren't always put that way. It was just like in an attempt to figure out and just place them in a few different boxes to get them straight and have some form of narrative cohesion. They were placed in 4 cycles. But like, go back to far enough, they weren't in those. If you go back to the first translations of these books, they're not in those cycles. So again, you have to reimagine in order to make sense of them a bit. And then you're looking at the last pages, the last books, the fractures in society, the fracture in language, the fracture in culture that is the consequence, the fracture of both famine, death, and going to the Americas from the Irish perspective and all over the world, and how many the diaspora there are of Ireland, and how they brought stories with them, but how many, how old are those stories really? It's kind of, I know when they're written down, the first book is 1200s, but at the same time, was that kind of current affairs myth-wise, or was that really the old stories? How far back are we really going? Because I guess Moriarty, who I absolutely love as well, I was reading a book of his recently. Again, a friend of mine gave me the book, and he was talking about the Battle of Taltu as this brilliant thing that comes up in the Book of Invasions as this fantastic, the Tuatha Dé Danann go under the hill, and the Sons of Mill, and the I guess the Milesians, or the Celts as we might kind of call them now, come and they take over Ireland. But was that the wiping out of the peoples before them, the people who had the megalithic tombs and those great burial chambers? Was that the end of an era there? Was that actually something that really tragically happened, of a new wave coming in, and a much older, much more sacred people not lasting? And that's just, I guess it's just like it's pretty hard to tell because it's so old, and we can get into the archaeological aspects of it, but they're not great stories. Too factual. Okay.
Yeah, but it's really worth thinking about that. Yeah, like I remember reading that there's a scientific principle, like for scientists going out and observing wildlife, that you can't observe something without changing it, and probably applies to all kinds of different science. I don't know if this always applies, but you can't go out and observe the gorillas without somehow impacting the gorillas. And it's like same for us as storytellers. There's no way we can tell stories, retell stories, reimagine stories without bringing our own values and our own world and individual life into them. You just can't. So we're always, as storytellers, the monks writing these things down, the people that they heard from, the people they heard from before, they were reimagining the stories. And so you and I, in our different ways, podcasting, writing, the different things we do, live performance, we're always reimagining it, and we're just part of that tradition of people who are always reimagining and trying to find a balance between what's gone before and what we bring, because that's what tradition is about. Like there's that lovely phrase, tradition is about tending the flames, not worshipping the ashes. I love that.
Keep it lit.
Keep it lit.
Keep the candle lit. That's gorgeous. I mean, I was kind of struck with a thought there as well of this kind of perpetual motion, like an upward spiral, like we're kind of continuously repeating and growing and changing and continuously repeating and growing and changing. And like, you know, every year is a cycle. You know, you're going between the solstices and the equinoxes, and in between you have the Celtic festivals, and they're, you know, on a map and a two-dimensional aspect. It's just, oh yeah, you're repeating this every again, but it's much more, you know, it's all in once as well, because you can experience winter in the heart of summer. You can experience the lightness of summer in the depths of winter, and the emotionality of the year is kind of all encompassing, just like a story can just span that amount of time as well in a few moments. But it's I'm not sure if I'm making sense here, but the wheel of time moves in some form of a cyclical pattern, that as you're dropping back to, you know, the old archaic stories with these really, you know, the warriors, the jokers, the maidens, the heroes, the youths and the lovers, and all of these archetypes that are prevalent in the stories, as they're being repeated, they're changing, and as they're repeated, they're growing anew, and as they're, you know, they're reliving a new kind of moment, the same but very different each time, and a new time, and every time they're spoken in a different voice, they're living in the ears of the listeners in this time now, which means a different thing right now than it did 5 years ago, and 10 years ago, and 20 and 50, and it'll be something much more, you know, whatever, different again in 5 and 10, 20 years. But again, I guess that's a bit of a random spiral.
And it's making me think of this, I think it was Joseph Campbell who I first encountered talking about this idea of myth and ceremony, or myth and ritual, as being the same thing, or mirrors of each other, and that like a ritual or ceremony is embodied myth. And when say some people gather together to sing up the sun, it's this almost the same thing as a story of how say Helios drives his sun chariot up into the sky. And there's the myth, there's the story, which we think of as this kind of disembodied thing of this happened and that happened and that happened and that's why that happens. But whenever we tell that story, or there's a ceremony embodies that same thing, that is the same as the myth. Like, you know, if we sing up the sun, that is why the sun rises. And I don't know where I'm going with that.
It's fair. That's fair. I mean, it's just an interesting aspect of story and repetition, and the different colors of it, I guess. I mean, like, you know, between the Greek and the Norse and the whatever African and South American, you'll find such similar aspects, you know, repeated throughout cultures, which is, again, we're all just, you know, encompassed in a different skin and bone shell, but we're so essentially the same, because we live these imagined lives so much more than we do actually our own, and in those imagined worlds we're experiencing the magic, or can do any, of these mythic kind of aspects of life. And that's like, if you actually really pay attention, you're like, it is magic, it's milk, there's a giant ball of fire in the sky heating everything that's making it grow. And like, if you just tap into that for a moment, you're like, what the fuck is going on? Yeah, no wonder there is a chariot running up in the sky, because there might as well be, you know. Because to even boiling down to science, it's magic. It's all magic.
Yeah, and every time we tell that or even think about it, we're adding to the dreaming, or to the totality of everything that's been, and to the mythic, all the myths of the world. Every time, you know, you told that story tonight, and everyone experienced it together, yet everyone experienced it differently. Everyone saw it differently in their own minds, and you could feel it in the room. You know, there's that we were talking about earlier. You could feel that buzz of like, the stories in the room now. And how beautiful and perfect is it that it's not just some dead thing on a page, but it's alive and it's living in everyone's different mind through you telling that story.
Gorgeous. So speaking of tonight, we had a story of Home for the Harvest inside MVP in Dublin, and you bought your ticket and didn't know you were coming, but then turns out you're crashing on my gaff, which is lovely. Very random, and delighted to have you, and it was fantastic. And I wasn't even there to welcome you. I felt very bad, but I did a workshop and I wasn't even there. Terrible. Such a bad host. And then suddenly I was driving in, I was like, hang on, why the fuck don't we get you to tell a story in the show? It's about the Fianna. I know you know loads of stuff there. I've heard your podcast. I listened to a few more in the car just to make sure I, again, could maybe ask you to do one. It was like, actually, he'd probably know what one to do himself. So we had a coffee today, 3 into the deep end. We're now sitting down post-show. It's late o'clock. We won't go into the time. We've had a lovely evening telling stories, mostly based around Quilta and the story Sorok and I put together, the Battle of Gower, the fall of the Fianna. And you popped up and told a beautiful story in the middle of this epic tale, which we'll probably be able to put up on our Patreon page for our Patreon supporters, because thanks lads, and also it won't be fully massively edited. It's a GoPro in the corner, but if our Patreon supporters want to listen to it, you can have that, and if you don't support us on Patreon, then you can't listen to it. Maybe, I guess. We'll probably put it up here eventually. Anyway, shout out to Patreon. So I was going to say, yeah, you're going to be telling on this podcast next week, presumably, whenever this comes out, you'll be telling the story that you told tonight. First time I heard it properly, you gave me the summary in a cafe in Dublin, and I was like, yes, tell that story. That's great. I fucking love it. And it was mental. It was barely about Fionn. He was in it, but, you know, do you want to give us the beats of this story, just to give us a kind of, what's the story about? Because I know it's mental, and we'll kind of have a little bit chat about it. But yeah, where'd you get it? What's it about? A brief summary, maybe.
I found it in good old Lady Gregory, Irish Myths and Legends. I call it Black, Brown and Grey. I think she called it something like that. And the beats of it are that the Fianna are going to be having a great big feast for Samhain. They've had a great harvest, and Fionn gets approached by these 3 guys who are like, do you want us to just look after, do a bit of sentry duty for you around the feast so you can all just enjoy yourselves, none of the lads have to do any work? Fionn says, cool, here's Bran, she'll help you out, on you go. And each of them takes turns to go out into the forest, check that nothing's amiss or weird, and there is weird stuff going on. So they all come to this hole out in the woods where very strange things are happening. It's clearly a gateway into the other world. And there is bloodshed, there is mayhem, there is the acquiring of magical items until lots of people get killed. and in the morning, Fionn's like, did you guys have a good time? Was everything fine? And they say, well, no, loads of weird stuff happened. And he's like, well, okay, lots good for you. And a story is there to be told.
Amazing. So a couple of things. Like, I loved the telling tonight. It was beautiful to see you just jump in with the music as well, because I know you maybe don't have as much experience with that, but Oisín laid the rhythm, I was able to pick up the bow on, and we just, that little magic underpreparedness happened where we were listening to the beats. There was a few lovely stops, you know, and the heartbeat of the story kind of just breathed, and we were really reactive, and you were paying, you gave us an awful lot to deal with, and your improvisation around the liveness of it was gorgeous. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and it was a beautiful, beautiful telling. So I'm looking forward to getting the recorded version, which is never really the same, in terms of, because you have to sit down and focus without the live atmosphere. So will you struggle with that, or do you prefer podcasting versus live stories, or what's your feeling with that?
I prefer live storytelling, definitely, because of course there's so much that's amazing about feeding off the atmosphere and the crowd and so on, and the interaction. I loved working with you guys as musicians, because it's such a different way of doing it, you know, because it's like the voice becomes one instrument amongst a whole, you know, team of instruments, and nice. You do it in a different way. And for me, I love stories and music. I very much enjoy telling stories without music. Stories and music is just one of those amazing combinations. So it is great, and I enjoy the novelty.
I love that, actually, that the voice becomes another instrument. Yeah. That's a really nice way of putting it, because it does, because there's musicality. There was musicality to your voice that was just so easy to follow, and I think that's what it is with you know, between the guitar or whatever instrument is following it. There's a musicality that's following the music of the voice, and the ups and the downs and tweaks and the in-betweens and the stops and the subtleties. And there was lovely silences. You really led that beautifully. How will you feel going without, like, now that you've had music, will you be able to do it without it?
Yeah, I've told it before, without music, and it's not a problem. I think I've only I've mostly told it to kids. I think it's one of those ones where if you get booked to go into school near Halloween and they're like, can we have a scary story?
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, maybe. And it's one of those great ones where it's like, it's not so dark that you are going to have a lot of angry letters from parents, but it's definitely dark and weird enough that the kids are going to be like, yeah, that was weird. That was really weird.
Yeah.
Which is, so that's a good area to play in.
Do you really want to get scared, kids? Really?
So I've had some
Rule number
great
one
times
with storytelling with kids: don't actually scare them.
Yeah. They have to think that they're being scared, but you can't actually scare them. If you do, you're in a lot of trouble.
You're in a lot of trouble. Yeah, that one's a nice edge. So, question: is Bran a female?
Yeah, the way I've read it, the way I've heard it, she's a female.
And Skjolan's the boy.
Yeah.
And Bran the brindled, Skjolan the white with the red stripe. I always thought, and this is just maybe because I thought Skjolan was the smaller, and I always thought Skjolan was the female and Bran was the boy, but that should be begins with B. But I am definitely not an expert. People confuse me as a storyteller who's done an awful lot of kind of research and an awful lot of scholarly kind of deep dives. I've done a bit. I've done a fair bit, but not. I'm definitely not. I need to be fact check my stuff. So I'm curious. I could have read somewhere, or I often like put two and two together and go, Brandon's the bigger one and Skjolan's the smaller one, girl, boy, or whatever. But when she said it there, I was like, oh, I could be sitting corrected. So you have Skjolan as the female, or Bran as and is Skjolan a male, or?
Skjolan is a male, yeah. And like yourself, I've done a good bit of reading, but I'm not an academic. I don't have my PhD.
Right.
There's people who know an awful lot more than me, but from what I know, Bran's a female.
Interesting.
And that just works for me. It feels right. I don't know.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's fun. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. I mean, I like adopting new bits of information and tying it in all the time. So, well, let's. I look up my sources. You look up yours. We come back and we'll have a little search. Okay, great. So Bran is sent off with the black, the brown, and the grey. These three colours I found really dark, really autumnal and shadowy and grim. And these three men in these three colours basically go off to let the Fianna have good fun. And just chill out. Yeah. You guys chill out. We'll stand guard, make sure nothing untoward happens. And is it around the Samhain time? Is it kind of?
Yeah, it's definitely
at Samhain. Yeah, great. Because it definitely has a vibe of a Samhain tale. So it makes sense that the Kaya comes in. The hag, a hag with a huge tooth comes in towards the end. That's a brilliant detail. She uses her tooth as a kind of walking stick.
Yeah, I love that. It's those little details that can make me fall in love with a story.
How is that going to happen? How do you, what?
You never seen an old woman walking down the street, giant tooth that she uses as a crutch to pull herself along?
I can't say that I have, Danny, no.
You need to get out, man.
Yeah. Maybe up in the hills in Scotland. You've some more weathered.
I see them all the time, yeah. The thing with a story like this, there are Fianna stories where the meaning or the kind of spiritual impact is really obvious and clear. Like for me, the Salmon of Wisdom story, the expansion of consciousness. Like for me, that's like a Western or Celtic form of talking about the Buddha's enlightenment, like going beyond the ordinary human state of consciousness and it being possible to know all things and being able to be one with all things. And you can meditate on that and have a profound impact. There are other Fianna stories like this one, which for me, I love it just because it's weird. It's just bizarre and you just don't know what's coming next. B, because I feel like there is some kind of spiritual language being talked about here, like through these colours, which would have had meaning and would have had impact for listeners 500 or 1,000 or however many years ago, but we don't have because we don't have the same dream dictionaries or whatever.
It does feel very dream-esque or nightmarish, in a sense. And it does kind of feel like it was thought up around the fire with maybe a few mushrooms. Lads, what was your trip? Jesus Christ. Why else did I tell you? Or something along those lines of like, it doesn't quite, again, someone's asked me recently of like, oh yeah, what's the moral of that story? What's the lesson for it to be? And an awful lot of like these stories don't have those because they're not, whereas the American aspects, I think it was an American actually asked me, because an awful lot of the attempt in America was to reattach some form of community and culture to where they are in their 400-year-old home, is to make lessons out of, or make stories with lessons and learn from them in order to ground themselves into the place. And I guess these are an awful lot of myths don't have those lessons, not obvious ones. Obviously, if you go to India, you have very highly spiritual obvious lessons. You've Bhagavad Gita is this amazing story about again, it's a war, it's a battle, but it's again profoundly about raising your consciousness and meditating and how the lessons of life are, take things personally. And there's some really on the nose self-help guidance there, fucking pulling from that still, and you don't get that in Irish mythology so much.
Yeah, it's just it's much more of a dark mirror. It's much more opaque, isn't it?
I like that dark mirror.
Yeah,
you kind of look in it, you might see a reflection. What the fuck is that?
Yeah.
And yet you kind of relate to it in some way. You're definitely enthralled by it. In this story, it seems very similar to Cúinla's house. Or the story of how Diarmuid got his love spot, these kind of otherworldly, I was saying it's kind of almost like the voyage stories going into the other world, and something mad happens. We don't quite know why it happens. There's an apple with golden trees, there's a monster revolving around inside in its skin, and there's a bridge with a lot of cats on it, or whatever. We don't quite know, but we're just gonna take our time here, try not to get killed, and come back with a story to tell. Yeah. And that's the voyage and return archetypal story. It's this you go off, it's the Gulliver's Travels, amazing journey, come back, nothing changes. It's just, what happened? Looking over your shoulder, cool, I don't know, let's just move on. It's all the journey, it's not the destination, it's not the reward, it's the experience.
Yeah, that's such a good point about just enjoying the experience of these stories, of the weird and wonderful and strange things that come along. And then also, I always relate these stories back to when I was at university. I was at the University of Sussex in Brighton, which is quite a kind of alternative left-wing kind of university. And as well as your main course, you had to, it sounds like your dinner, but I mean your main subject. You had to study these other subjects, and I signed up for the shamanic consciousness, and I was reading all these academic texts from these guys who've gone and studied with Siberian shamans, the real deal kind of guys, and they were talking about giving these incredibly detailed accounts of otherworld journeys, of how they used the techniques they used and still use to go into another frame of consciousness and to enter the other world. And they went to this island or this strange land, and they met this giant who opened up their stomach and stuffed them full of crystals. And they went to this other place where there's this bizarre chicken woman creature who's trying to kill them, so they had to disguise themselves. And they write about this stuff as if it's, as if it's writing the report at work. It's felt very detailed.
Giant chicken tried to eat my toe. Yes. I said, no, giant chicken, no.
Yes, you cannot eat my toe. And I always go back to them when I'm reading these kind of stories where, the Fianna are out at night and they're out hunting, it all gets dark, and then they see these lights and there's some weird old man saying, do you want to come into my house? In they go, boom, they're in the other world. And they're being tested and weird things are happening, and they have to use their wits usually, they have to use cunning, and they come out with it with magical items, which is what tends to happen when these accounts of Siberian shamans, they come back with these items or magical cloak, or they've been searching for a part of a person's soul that's missing, which is how they kind of heal a sick person. They bring them back, and it just always seems like our kind of parallel of that, with a different kind of landscape being described, a Celtic landscape, Western Europe, Northern European landscape, and a certain, and it being in story form, rather than talking about, this is how I healed this person, and just, different language and architecture.
Yeah, it's a funny one again, without the reward or the jewel at the end of it, it's these three lads. After, again, it's just a funny one. black, the grey, and the brown, or the black, brown, grey, and then there's 3 other coloured creatures that jump out. You've the what is it, yellow,
red, blue, and green.
Red, blue, and green.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just like, yeah. I mean, they're just, what is that? These just very one tone, one mode people. What is that? Like, you know, it's almost like a mask. It's the kind of you know, you're not giving any other detail. Literally nothing. There's no facial. There's no eyes. There's no description. There's no hair. It's just one. You're one tone, and you do one thing, and there's nothing else there other than your physical color and body and shape. And it's almost bizarre that you don't get to visualize them other than these blobs of color, and it is quite dreamlike and yeah, it's trippy. I'm not quite sure what I'm trying to say other than it's a bit mad. I look forward to hearing it. Okay, so Daniel, House of Legends is your podcast. People can find you on Spotify, all podcast platforms.
Yeah, the podcast is available in all the usual places.
And what are you writing at the moment?
I am at the moment writing Scottish Myths and Legends Volume 2 and Irish Mythology and The Spey Queen, which is Volume 2 of the Orkney Cycle, which is my prehistoric Scottish fantasy epic. Based
loosely and tying in with Skahak, am I right?
Yeah, it's the book 1 is based on the story of Asipattle and the Mucklemeister Stoorworm, or really, really big serpent, which is a Scottish kind of trickster hero story stroke creation myth, and then it expands out over the course of the books into bringing in Skahak and the Cailleach and lots of different mythological characters through the lens of a kind of Game of Thronesy, high pace, high blood and guts, high magic fantasy story.
Amazing. I mean, like the only books I ever read are fantasy or myths and legends. To be honest, I listen to a lot of like books that I can't ever concentrate and read because the only ones that I actually be able to page turn are fantasy. So it's great that you're reimagining these stories in a fantastical way. So that's I'm delighted to hear that. And last but not least, tell me a little bit more about your storytelling course and your membership aspect, because we did a storytelling course during lockdown. We were delighted with it. I think we did 4 courses back to back. People are still asking us, are we doing another one? I've gotten a bit sick of Zoom, so I can't quite commit myself to doing any more. I said it would this year, but we just got bombed out of it busy, so we decided, you know what, we're just going to put a pin in that one for a moment. So what's your answer to post-COVID, post-Zoom, online teaching?
Keep doing it is my answer to that.
I was afraid you were going to say that.
Yeah, it works for me because obviously we all know we prefer being together than being on Zoom, but I've made all these amazing connections throughout the world. I've got an audience throughout the world, and I love working with people who I wouldn't get to work with if we didn't work together over Zoom. And I see all the amazing things that happen when people take up storytelling. So I carry on doing it, and then I carry on doing stuff in person as well. And that's a happy mix for me. So what I do is the main 2 things are there's Myth Singers, which is a year-long intensive small group coaching apprenticeship or Celtic storytelling apprenticeship. I'm calling it now because it's gone more Celtic. For the people who are like, yes, I want to do this. I want to tell stories. It is in the depths of my soul. Brilliant. Go to Myth Singers, sign up. We'll have a great time. And I love the relationships we make doing that because we work together for a whole year. We would meet twice a month. So, you know, we become really close, you know, as a group. Everyone who I've worked with through that is a friend. And it's really special. So there's no way I want to give that up, even if it's on Zoom. And then the less committed people, I have the Roundhouse program. So that's a storytelling school stroke community where it's just like a small monthly or annual membership fee. And there's at least 2, usually 3 or more monthly meetups online. There's lots of online courses I put together with visiting guests and storytellers and so on. So there's just loads and loads of things going on for people who want to be part of a storytelling community but aren't able to be there in person or whatever reason it is.
And in terms of your step-by-step, how you put it together, if you pass it on to me, we'll probably do one of those. I'm joking. But we probably might. Now that you've told us your secrets, great. Yeah. I mean, hey, look, we copy and we steal and we populate all ideas. So I'm passing it on now. I'm delighted to hear that you're so focused on, community building and storytelling aspects of people coming together, because I think we need more of it, and it's great to see it out there. It's great to see you writing so much, telling so much. Delighted to have you tell a story tonight at a live gig. Delighted to host you, and on this podcast have you not only share your passion and remind me why I love stories and why I love the Irish stories and the aspect of storytelling and why I get so giddy about it, but also why it's important to keep doing it. And I'm looking forward to hearing the story of black, brown and grey.
In whatever order. And Aron, thank you so much. It's wonderful to meet you and have this chat with you and to perform with you tonight. I've been driving around Ireland for the last few weeks listening to your voice and your sister's voice, and you guys have been incredibly helpful for me, not just your telling of the stories, but also just your attitude to the stories and your openness and your approach to being free and playing around with them and reinventing them in your own way. I'm very, very happy to be here.
Delighted. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to hear that we were able to keep you company. And my sister, who's a little bit sick at the moment, although she knocked it out of the park tonight,
She did.
Despite the fact that she was sick. Like, she's just a disgrace. She's just unbelievably good, and then she goes, I'm sick and tired, I'm going home. So she would have been here on the fact that she's definitely asleep, and hopefully we'll be on your podcast soon, because we'll probably team up with you on the other aspect. And thanks, Danny.
You will, but you have to be.
You!
Yeah.
All right, Daddy, you. Nice one. I think that's a wrap.
Okay.
Jesus, that was